U.S. Delta soldiers laughed at the veteran's tattoo until the general showed he had one just like it. Sometimes the most dangerous assumption is believing that age diminishes valor, or that youth automatically commands respect. This is the story of how a simple tattoo on an old man's arm triggered a chain of events that reached the highest levels of military command, and reminded everyone present that true honor is earned through sacrifice, not displayed through arrogance. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. The bell above the door of the Scrambled Egg Diner chimed its familiar welcome as two young men in military fatigues strode inside, their boots heavy against the worn linoleum floor. Staff Sergeant Jake Cutler moved with the swagger of someone who had never questioned his own superiority. His chest puffed out to display the airborne wings and special forces tab that marked him as elite among the elite. Beside him, Sergeant Danny Reyes followed with the nervous energy of someone caught between loyalty to his partner and an uneasy feeling that they were about to cross a line. In the corner booth where he had sat every Tuesday morning for the past 7 years, 81-year-old Glenn Patterson quietly sipped his black coffee and worked on the crossword puzzle from yesterday's newspaper. His weathered hands moved slowly but steadily, filling in answers with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. To casual observers, he appeared to be exactly what he seemed, an elderly retiree, passing time in a neighborhood diner, unremarkable except for his consistent presence and unfailing politeness to the staff. But it was the tattoo on Glenn's left forearm that caught Cutler's attention and sparked the confrontation that would change everything. The ink had faded with age, but the design remained clear. A serpent biting its own tail, forming a perfect circle, with a 5-pointed star positioned precisely in the center. To most people, it would have appeared to be simply an old military tattoo, the kind that countless veterans carried as reminders of their service. To Cutler, however, it represented something that triggered his arrogance and sense of superiority. "Well, well," Cutler announced loudly enough for the entire diner to hear, his voice dripping with mockery as he approached Glenn's table. "Look what we have here, Reyes." Another old-timer trying to play soldier with some fancy ink. Glenn looked up from his crossword puzzle with the calm expression of someone who had encountered bullies before and understood that responding with anger would only escalate the situation. He folded his newspaper carefully and set it aside, then took another sip of his coffee while studying the two young soldiers with eyes that had seen far more than they could imagine. "Good morning," Glenn said simply, his voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who felt no need to prove anything to anyone. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Cutler laughed, a harsh sound that made several other customers look up from their meals with concern. "Oh, it's about to get even more beautiful, old man. You see, my partner and I here, we're actual special forces. We've earned our place in the most elite units in the military, and we don't appreciate wannabes like you walking around with tattoos you have no right to wear." The accusation of stolen valor hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Other customers had stopped eating to watch the confrontation unfold, sensing that they were witnessing something that would escalate beyond mere words. Sarah Martinez, the waitress who had been serving Glenn for years, felt her heart rate increase as she recognized the danger in Cutler's tone. "That's quite an accusation, son," Glenn replied calmly, his hands steady as he reached for his coffee cup. "What makes you think I haven't earned whatever symbols I choose to wear?" Cutler stepped closer to Glenn's table, invading the older man's personal space with the deliberate intimidation tactics he had learned worked on most civilians. "Because I know what that tattoo represents, Grandpa. That's not something you pick up at a tattoo parlor because it looks cool. That's a symbol that belongs to warriors, not old men who probably never left the States during their so-called service." The insult was calculated to provoke a reaction, but Glenn remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. He had learned long ago that the loudest people were rarely the most dangerous, and that true strength often manifested as quiet confidence rather than aggressive posturing. Reyes shifted uncomfortably beside his partner, his instincts telling him that something was wrong with Cutler's assessment. The old man's composure in the face of direct confrontation suggested someone who had faced far worse than verbal abuse and emerged with his dignity intact. But Reyes had learned not to question Cutler's judgment, especially when it came to military matters. "You know what I think?" Cutler continued, his voice growing louder as Glenn's calm response frustrated his attempts at intimidation. "I think you're a fraud. I think you bought that tattoo because you wanted people to think you were something special, when really you're just another old guy living off fantasies about a military career that never happened. Glenn set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, then looked directly at Cutler with eyes that seemed to see straight through the young soldier's bluster to the insecurity beneath. Son, you seem very concerned about what other people have earned. Perhaps you should focus more on living up to the standards of your own service rather than questioning mine. The quiet rebuke hit Cutler like a slap across the face, exposing his behavior as petty and unprofessional in a way that made him even angrier. Without warning, he reached across the table and grabbed Glenn's wrist, pulling the old man's arm toward him to get a better look at the tattoo. "Let me see this fake ink up close," Cutler snarled, his fingers pressing hard enough to leave marks on Glenn's weathered skin. The moment Cutler's hand made contact with the tattoo, something changed in Glenn's eyes. For just an instant, the quiet retiree disappeared, replaced by someone far more dangerous, a man whose body might have aged but whose instincts remained sharp as razors. The diner seemed to fade around him as memories flooded back with vivid intensity. The humid heat of Vietnamese jungle, the weight of gear and weapons, the brotherhood forged in combat that transcended rank and background. He was 23 again, leading a squad through enemy territory on a mission so classified that even decades later he couldn't discuss the details. He could smell the cordite and sweat, could hear the whispered radio communications and the distant sound of helicopters. Most clearly, he could remember the night they had sat around a small fire, 5 survivors out of 12 who had started the mission, making a pact that would bind them together for life. The tattoo wasn't decoration or military pride. It was a sacred symbol of brotherhood, sacrifice, and promises kept under the worst possible circumstances. Each element had meaning that these young soldiers couldn't begin to understand. The serpent represented the cycle of life and death they had witnessed. The circle symbolized their unbreakable bond, and the star marked them as members of something that officially didn't exist. "Get your hands off me," Glenn said quietly. But there was something in his voice that made Cutler instinctively release his grip and step backward. For just a moment, the old man's mask had slipped, revealing glimpses of someone who had been far more dangerous than 2 special forces soldiers could imagine. But the moment passed, and Glenn returned to his coffee as if nothing had happened, leaving Cutler confused and frustrated by his inability to provoke the reaction he had expected. The young soldier had no way of knowing that he had just laid hands on a man whose military service was so classified that most of his missions remained sealed in government archives, or that the tattoo he had mocked represented membership in a unit that had laid the groundwork for every special operations force that followed. As tension filled the small diner and other customers began reaching for their phones to call for help, none of them could have predicted that one phone call was already being made. A call that would bring the full weight of military authority down on this quiet Tuesday morning confrontation. Sarah Martinez had been working at the Scrambled Egg Diner for 8 years, and in all that time she had never seen anything that made her as angry as watching 2 young soldiers humiliate a kind elderly man who had never caused trouble for anyone. Her hands shook with rage as she watched Cutler grab Glenn's arm, and she knew she couldn't just stand by and watch this continue without doing something to help. Glenn Patterson was one of her favorite customers, the kind of man who always said please and thank you, who remembered her name and asked about her family, who left generous tips even though she could tell money was tight for him. He had helped her through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier by simply listening without judgment and offering quiet words of encouragement when she needed them most. The idea that anyone would treat him with such cruelty made her feel physically sick. "I need to make a quick phone call," she told her manager, stepping away from the counter where she had been watching the confrontation unfold. "This is important." She pulled out her cell phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for her cousin Stacy, who worked as an administrative assistant at some kind of military headquarters. Sarah didn't fully understand what Stacy did for work, but she knew it involved high-ranking officers and important meetings, and she hoped that her cousin might be able to help somehow. The phone rang 3 times before Stacy answered with the brisk professional tone she used during work hours. "This is Stacy Williams. How can I help you?" "Stacy, it's Sarah. I need your help with something urgent. There are 2 soldiers in my diner right now, harassing an elderly customer, and I don't know what to do about it." Stacy sighed with the weary patience of someone who dealt with military personnel complaints on a regular basis. "Sarah, You know I can't get involved in every dispute between soldiers and civilians. If they're being disorderly, you should call the local police, not the military. This is different, Sarah insisted, her voice rising with frustration and fear as she watched Cutler continue to intimidate Glenn. They're accusing him of stolen valor, making fun of his military tattoo, treating him like garbage. This man is one of the kindest people I know, and he doesn't deserve this kind of treatment from people who are supposed to represent our military. Look, Sarah, I understand you're upset, but military personnel off-duty are still subject to civilian law enforcement. There's really nothing I can do from here except suggest you call the police if you feel there's a genuine threat. Sarah felt tears of frustration gathering in her eyes as she realized her cousin wasn't going to help. But then she remembered something Glenn had mentioned once during a quiet conversation about his past. Stacy, wait. The tattoo they're making fun of. It's unusual. It's a snake biting its own tail in a circle, with a 5-pointed star in the middle. Does that mean anything to you? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Stacy finally spoke again, her voice had completely changed, taking on an urgency that made Sarah's heart rate increase. Sarah, I need you to describe that tattoo again, exactly as you saw it, and I need the name of the man who has it. His name is Glenn Patterson, and the tattoo is on his left forearm. It's faded, like it's old, but you can still see all the details clearly. Why? Do you recognize it? Sarah could hear the sound of rapid typing on a computer keyboard, followed by what sounded like papers being shuffled urgently. When Stacy spoke again, her voice carried a level of seriousness that Sarah had never heard from her cousin before. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Do not let those soldiers leave the diner. Do not let Glenn Patterson leave either. I don't care what you have to do. Call the police, fake a medical emergency, anything, but keep everyone there until help arrives. Help? What kind of help? Stacy, you're scaring me. I can't explain over the phone, but if this is who I think it is, those soldiers have made a mistake that could end their careers. I'm interrupting a meeting right now to get people involved who need to know about this situation immediately. The line went quiet except for the sound of Stacy's footsteps moving quickly across what sounded like a large office space. Sarah could hear her cousin speaking to someone in urgent, low tones, though she couldn't make out the specific words. When Stacy came back on the line, she was clearly in motion, probably heading toward whatever meeting she had mentioned interrupting. Sarah, I've got to go, but I need you to promise me you'll keep everyone at that diner until someone arrives to handle this situation. This is more important than you understand. How long do I need to keep them here? And who exactly is coming? I don't know how long, but probably not more than an hour. As for who's coming, let's just say it's someone with enough authority to straighten out this mess and make sure those soldiers understand exactly how badly they've misjudged the situation. The call ended, leaving Sarah staring at her phone with a mixture of confusion and growing apprehension. She had expected her cousin to maybe make a few phone calls or file a complaint, not to trigger what sounded like an emergency response from high-ranking military officials. She looked back toward Glenn's table, where Cutler was now standing directly over the elderly man with his fists clenched, clearly building toward physical confrontation. Whatever was coming to help, Sarah realized she needed to buy time to prevent the situation from escalating beyond words. Meanwhile, 300 miles away at the Joint Special Operations Command headquarters, Stacy Williams burst through the doors of Conference Room Alpha without knocking, interrupting a briefing on counter-terrorism operations that included some of the most senior military officers in the country. Ma'am, this meeting is classified, a security officer began, but Stacy cut him off with the kind of urgency that indicated a genuine emergency. I need to speak with General Thorne immediately. It's about Project Omega. The room fell silent at the mention of those two words. Project Omega was a designation that hadn't been spoken aloud in military circles for over 2 decades, referring to classified operations that were buried so deeply in government archives that most current personnel didn't even know they had existed. General Marcus Thorne, a man whose chest bore ribbons from conflicts spanning 4 decades, looked up from the briefing materials with sharp attention. Everyone else out, he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. As the room cleared, Stacy approached the general with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline and the weight of what she was about to report. Sir, there's a situation developing at a civilian location. A man named Glenn Patterson is being harassed by active-duty Special Forces personnel who are accusing him of stolen valor. They're specifically targeting a tattoo that matches the description of Project Omega identification markings. General Thorne's expression changed completely, his professional composure giving way to something that looked like barely controlled fury. He stood up from the conference table with the sudden energy of someone much younger than his 62 years. "Get my security detail ready for immediate departure," he ordered, his voice carrying the kind of cold anger that made subordinates move with unusual speed. "And find out exactly where this Glenn Patterson is located right now." As military personnel scrambled to fulfill the general's orders, none of them could have imagined that they were about to witness a confrontation that would remind everyone present about the true meaning of respect, sacrifice, and the bonds forged by warriors who had faced death together in service to their country. General Marcus Thorne's boots struck the Pentagon corridor with urgent precision as his security detail struggled to match his pace toward the helicopter pad. The classified briefing he had abandoned could wait. What couldn't wait was addressing a situation that had triggered memories buried for over 40 years. "Sir, we have the location," reported Major Chen, consulting her tablet while jogging to keep up. "The Scrambled Egg Diner on Maple Street. Local police report no calls yet, but the situation is developing." Thorne's jaw tightened. The fact that civilian law enforcement hadn't been called suggested the confrontation hadn't escalated to violence yet. "What do we know about the personnel involved?" Thorne asked as they reached the elevator. "Staff Sergeant Jake Cutler and Sergeant Danny Reyes, both 5th Special Forces Group. Cutler has several informal complaints about inappropriate behavior toward civilians." Thorne's expression darkened. 5th Group was his old unit, where he had learned leadership under men like Glenn Patterson. As they climbed aboard the waiting Black Hawk, Major Chen hesitated before speaking. "Sir, Patterson's service record is mostly classified above my level. What I can see shows Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, and Silver Star with multiple oak leaf clusters." The helicopter lifted off as Thorne reflected on the irony. Soldiers who considered themselves elite were attacking a man whose combat record dwarfed their experience. "The tattoo description matches Project Omega personnel files," Chen added over the engine noise. "If this is the same Glenn Patterson, he's one of the founding members of modern special operations doctrine." Thorne rolled up his sleeve to reveal his own matching tattoo, remembering the night 43 years ago when 5 survivors had made their sacred pact. The serpent represented death and rebirth, the circle their unbreakable bond, the star their membership in something beyond normal military hierarchy. As the helicopter descended toward the diner parking lot, Thorne could see the situation escalating inside. One soldier stood aggressively over an elderly man, while customers watched with concern. The confrontation that had begun with mockery was about to become a lesson in military history and respect for those whose service was written in blood and sealed in classified archives. The diner door burst open as General Thorne strode inside, his security detail forming a protective perimeter. Breakfast conversations died instantly as customers realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Cutler, mid-grab of Glenn's shirt, froze as he found himself face-to-face with a general officer whose ribbons spanned 4 decades of conflict. His arrogance evaporated like steam. "Step away from that man immediately," Thorne commanded with absolute authority. Reyes went pale, recognizing the insignia that marked Thorne as one of the military's most powerful officers. Glenn remained seated but straightened, recognizing his former lieutenant despite the decades between them. "General Thorne," he said quietly. "It's been a long time, sir." Thorne approached with measured steps, ignoring the frozen soldiers. He came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. Not casual courtesy, but full ceremonial respect. "Sergeant Major Patterson," Thorne replied formally, holding his salute until Glenn returned it with precise movement. "The honor is mine, as always." The exchange left everyone stunned. Sarah Martinez felt tears gathering as she realized her instinct to protect Glenn had been more accurate than she'd imagined. Thorne turned toward Cutler and Reyes, his expression shifting to something dangerous. "Gentlemen, you've been questioning this man's right to wear military symbols. Perhaps you'd like to explain your assessment." Without breaking eye contact, Thorne rolled up his left sleeve, revealing his own identical tattoo, the serpent circle, and five-pointed star rendered in ink that had remained dark for 4 decades. This tattoo represents membership in Project Omega, a classified unit that operated in Southeast Asia. Sergeant Major Patterson was my team leader during a mission that went sideways. When I took shrapnel, he carried me through 12 miles of enemy territory over 3 days, fighting off attacks while keeping me alive. The diner fell silent except for the coffee machine's hum. Everyone understood they were hearing about events that had shaped history, even if details would never appear in official records. The tattoo was a sacred promise among 5 survivors that we would never forget what we experienced together, Thorne explained. Sergeant Major Patterson's tactical innovations became the foundation for every special operations doctrine that followed. The training you learned, the procedures you follow, all trace back to men like him. Cutler and Reyes stood stunned, realizing they had harassed one of the founding fathers of modern special operations. "Now then," Thorne said coldly, "you owe Sergeant Major Patterson a sincere apology, after which you'll report to my office tomorrow to explain your behavior and discuss your future in special operations." Their careers hung in the balance, dependent on demonstrating genuine remorse and understanding of the lesson about military history, respect, and the consequences of assumptions about those whose service predated their existence. The harsh office lights cast shadows across Cutler and Reyes as they stood at attention, awaiting their fate. 24 hours after the diner humiliation, neither had slept well contemplating career termination. Thorne reviewed their files, showing adequate technical skills but troubling patterns of arrogance, exactly what could poison unit morale and undermine special operations values. "Your behavior was a betrayal of everything this uniform represents," Thorne began. "You harassed a veteran whose service record makes your accomplishments look like basic training." "Sir, we had no idea who he was," Cutler started. "Stop! The problem isn't that you didn't know who Glenn Patterson was. The problem is thinking his identity mattered. You believed some veterans deserve respect while others don't, based on your assessment of worthiness." Thorne studied their faces, looking for genuine understanding rather than mere concern about consequences. "I considered stripping your special operations qualifications. However, Sergeant Major Patterson requested I reconsider, suggesting education might be more valuable than punishment." Both soldiers looked confused why the man they'd humiliated would intercede. The Legacy Project pairs experienced veterans with active duty personnel. "You'll be assigned for 3 years, working directly with veterans from conflicts spanning 50 years. You'll be removed from operational duties, focusing on documenting interviews and organizing historical materials." 1 year later, Cutler encountered Glenn at a hardware store while shopping for materials to build veteran wheelchair ramps. The Legacy Project had fundamentally changed him through exposure to stories and sacrifices of those whose service had shaped the military. "Mr. Patterson," Cutler said without his former arrogance, helping Glenn reach items from a high shelf, "I owe you an apology, not just for the diner but for the attitude that led to it. This past year learning about military history has shown me how wrong I was." Glenn studied Cutler's face, seeing genuine change from exposure to perspectives he'd never considered. "I've learned more about military service this year than in all my previous training," Cutler continued. "More importantly, I've learned about humility and respect." "Those lessons serve you well both in uniform and out," Glenn replied. "The fact you're still learning means you're on the right path. Your recommendations saved my career and made me a better person. Why did you give me a second chance instead of letting me face consequences?" Glenn smiled with the wisdom of someone who understood the difference between enemies deserving defeat and young people needing guidance. Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn from mistakes. The measure isn't whether you make errors, but whether you grow from them. You've chosen to grow. Their encounter had come full circle, from confrontation to education to mutual respect. The lesson beginning with arrogance had evolved into understanding that military service created bonds, transcending rank and time, and that true honor was demonstrated through continued service rather than displays of superiority.